Let's be honest, who doesn't love a goofy fighting game character? Whether it be a straight up joke character or a serious fighter with a goofy personality, I think there's always a place for them in the fighting game roster. Capcom must have thought the same thing during development of Capcom vs SNK, as the game's updated release, Capcom vs SNK Pro, included two such characters, even giving them front cover billing, at least for the Dreamcast version: Dan Hibiki and Joe Higashi. Dan is generally credited as the first dedicated joke character in fighting games. Debuting as a secret character in the first Street Fighter Alpha game, Dan is an affectionate parody of SNK's fighting games, but very specifically the Art of Fighting series. Dan's attacks are primarily humorous, ineffective takes on Ryo's Art of Fighting moveset, and he has his own dedicated taunt attacks as well. It should probably be noted here that Art of Fighting is largely considered to be the first fighting game to meaningfully implement taunts. Joe Higashi, on the other hand, was one of the original 3 playable characters in Fatal Fury alongside Terry and Andy Bogard. Joe's a talented Muay Thai fighter, and though he's absolutely not a Joe character like Dan, his appearances throughout the Fatal Fury series and later King of Fighters would become just a bit goofier over time. He still knows when to get serious for a fight though. Both characters, as mentioned earlier, were the headlining additions for Capcom vs SNK Pro, and the cover art featuring them is a playful little nod to the box art for the game's initial release featuring Ryu and Kyo. Capcom vs SNK's plot is about as paper thin as it gets, but the general setup is that both the Masters and Garcia Foundations have collaborated to throw a martial arts tournament, and the general framing device for the game revolves around a news network covering the fights as they play out. It's an aspect of the first game's aesthetics that I don't think gets nearly enough credit, but maybe that's a matter for a different potential video. During the arcade ladder, Bison or Geese, depending on who you're using, will make their presence known and derail things, with your team of chosen characters abandoning the tournament to tail them. Once you defeat them, the game's ending shows that in your team's absence, the tournament itself was won off screen by the team of Joe and Dan. One of the only presumably legit big wins Dan has, and it's in a non-canonical crossover. Go figure. Being that Dan had at least 2 Versus games under his belt by the time that Joe made it into Capcom vs SNK, I'll cover those appearances first. Dan Hibiki is the son of Go Hibiki, a martial artist who tragically died at the hands of Sagat. During their fight, Go decided to take Sagat's eye via gouging, and Sagat decided to take Go's life. This would spur Dan to train in martial arts for the express purpose of avenging his father. He very briefly trained under Goken, who kicked him out from the dojo once he realized that vengeance was Dan's primary motivation. Dan eventually did run into Sagat during Street Fighter Alpha 2 and beats him at the end of his arcade mode. I think the implication is that Sagat let him win out of remorse for what he did to his father, but the only media depicting this detail is the Udon Street Fighter Unlimited series, which, to my knowledge, isn't official canon. It does bear mentioning that by the time of Alpha 3, Dan seems to have moved on from his beef with Sagat, so there's probably at least a little truth to it in series. Dan doesn't take part in the World Warrior tournament during Street Fighter 2 primarily because in real life, he hadn't been created yet. Street Fighter 4 provides a canonical reason for his absence though. No one told him about the tournament.
You were in that tournament, right, Jimmy? Why didn't you tell me about it, man? I thought we were bros.
Sorry, I did try and contact you, but you hadn't paid your phone bill.
In the intervening years since the Alpha games, Dan opened up the Saikyo Dojo with the intent of taking on new students to learn his self-developed style. Sadly, Dan doesn't get very many students, though Blanc is usually there to give him some moral support. The word Saikyo itself translates to the strongest or the greatest depending on the context. Dan is, if nothing else, humble. Sakura also joined his dojo, though this was more so with the ulterior motive of possibly having an avenue to cross paths with Ryu down the line. Dan's first appearance in the Versus series was in Marvel Superheroes vs Street Fighter. He's, as you'd expect, a joke character, though in the Japanese release he shares that distinction with Norimaro, and whoo boy, that's a video for another day. Like in his home series, all of his attacks are hilariously ineffective. If you've watched the breakdown I did for Ryu, you may recall that I talked about how Street Fighter characters would be buffed for the Marvel vs games to measure up against the larger-than-life Marvel characters. That doesn't really apply to Dan all that much. Just like the other Street Fighter characters in the game, Dan gets a completely unique new theme for this game. It's an upbeat, completely non-serious theme, and it fits Dan like a glove. I'm a big fan of the accompanying piano you can hear throughout the song. Dan is voiced by Osamu Hosoi in this game, who also voiced Dan in just about every pre-Street Fighter IV appearance of his. Hosoi has voiced a few other Capcom and Capcom-adjacent characters as well, including Hydron in Red Earth, Jet Stingray in Mega Man X4, and Alan in Street Fighter EX and Fighting Layer. Before we even get to the moveset, there's a little Easter egg you can trigger at the start of a fight. On the versus screen, if you hold light punch, Dan's intro animation will change to him being thrown right into the stage, complete with a comical explosion. Talk about starting things off with a bang. Dan's first special move is the Godoken, done with a quarter circle forward and punch. This move is a parody of Ryo's Kaoken fireball, similarly launched with one hand, though the fireball itself is even smaller than it is in the Alpha games. Dan's dedicated anti-air special is the Koryuken. In Street Fighter Alpha 2, this move has some pretty funky properties that get somewhat translated to this game. So, true to it being just a whack-ass Shoryuken, it doesn't have any invulnerability. Usually, anyway. Every now and then, when Dan performs one, he'll flash white as he does it. When this happens, Dan actually receives invulnerability for the duration of the attack. This was thought to be RNG for a while, but it was eventually discovered that these can be intentionally triggered as well. Essentially, at the beginning of any given round, the game secretly keeps track of any of Dan's actions, being attacks, jumping, or taunting. If the 23rd action Dan does in a round is the Koryuken, he will always get the invulnerable version. Afterwards, the count resets, and it also resets at the beginning of each round as well. There's also a separate 12.5% chance that the invulnerability will trigger with each Koryuken input regardless of action count. Probably because Marvel is a much more faster game, this was slightly adjusted for his Marvel appearances. Koryuken gets invincibility for every 4th use, making it a lot easier to plan around. Granted, you could just play a better character with a more reliable anti-air, but if you're using Dan, you're probably either proving a point or you just like the guy, so hey, more power to you. Danku Kyaku is done with a quarter circle back and kick. This one's a knockoff of Ryo's Hien Shibu Kyaku. Quarter circle forward and kick gives Dan a new move unique to this crossover, Premium Sign. He takes out a picture of himself, autographs it, and flings it at the opponent. I couldn't make this up if I tried. This is not a good move by any means, but it doesn't stop it from being absolutely hilarious. Dan wouldn't be Dan if he didn't have his patented taunts, and they're here in full effect as well. You have his standard taunt, his air taunt, and his 2 rolling taunts, one that goes forwards, and one that goes backwards. Dan's first hyper combo is the Shinku Godoken, done with a quarter circle forward and 2 punches. Dan throws out a hilariously small fireball with poor range that can hit multiple times. This super really is about as bad as it looks. His second hyper combo is the Koryu Rekka, done with a quarter circle forward and 2 kicks. This move parodies Ken's Shoryu Reppa move. His third hyper combo is the Hisho Buraiken, done with a quarter circle back and 2 kicks. This move is a direct parody of Ryo's Ryuku Ranbu Desperation move in Art of Fighting. Of course, because it's Dan, it's off on comparison, and the point is driven home further by Dan's version lacking the auto dash at the beginning that Ryo's does, making this pretty useless unless you're already in your opponent's face. Next is Chohatsu Densetsu, or Legendary Taunt as it's more commonly translated. This is done with 2 quarter circle forwards motions and taunt. Dan does a series of taunts that don't do any damage whatsoever to the opponent. Well, maybe emotional damage, but that's subjective. If you do manage to pull off the whole thing in a match, make sure to thank your opponent for being a good sport and letting it rock. Last is Otoko Michi, or Way of the Man. This is a Raging Demon-esque super that Dan performs where he grabs the opponent and explodes. The move even reinforces the Raging Demon parody further by making the inputs the reverse of that super. This one instantly reduces his health to 1 and generally isn't worth it at all. Funny as hell though. Dan's assist is the Godoken. Good luck hitting anyone with it. Here are Dan's two colors. Dan's ending sequence is a fun one. This one requires some context here if you're not already in on the joke. Dan, being an Art of Fighting parody character, appropriately has an ending that parodies Ryo's original Art of Fighting ending, where Ryo's sister Yuri steps in to stop Ryo from killing Mr. Karate, who's later revealed to be their father, Takuma. Since I'll probably never get the chance to talk about this again, I want to highlight Dan's sister here, since she's a really interesting case of a character created for a one-off gag that actually ended up becoming a canon character. Until a few years ago, this ending was the one and only instance of Dan ever being shown to have a sister, and it was assumed by many that it was just a joke meant for this ending, and he probably doesn't have any siblings in the mainline continuity. Hell, she wasn't even named. But then came Street Fighter V, and with it, the Shadaloo Combat Research Institute site, which featured character profiles for characters all across the Street Fighter shared universe. Granted, these profiles didn't always adhere to canon, some were just there for fun, but it was interesting to see characters from forgotten games nonetheless, like Cody's brother Kyle mentioned in any capacity. One such character mentioned was Dan's sister, now named Yuriko, just to drive home her being a Yuri parody even further, and also further reinforced by her birthday and blood type being the same as Yuri's as depicted in SNK official media. Her profile explicitly mentions that she exists in a parallel continuity to the mainline Street Fighter games, which is probably Capcom's way of mentioning the Versus games in a legal-friendly manner. But not too long after, Street Fighter V revamped its in-game shop storefront, and the person running the shop was Yuriko herself, officially becoming part of the mainline canon. Believe it or not, Dan actually isn't the worst character in Marvel vs. Capcom 2. Even wilder, he actually got a few buffs in the transition to this game. For one, he still retains the invulnerability on every 4th Koryuken here. His most notable buff this time around is being able to use Dan Kukiyaku in the air. This actually gives Dan a degree of mobility he just flat out didn't have before, and it's actually an okay way to move around the screen. This would actually later extend to mainline Street Fighter games as well, with Dan also getting this ability in Street Fighter Alpha 3, which released a few months later. Dan's legendary Taunt Super also gets a buff, though it may have been unintentional given that it's due to Marvel 2's system mechanics more than anything. Dan can actually use a delayed hyper combo at any time before the final pose and cancel into a teammate's hyper combo, making it somewhat viable to use the taunt to bait your opponent into punishing it, only for them to eat an unexpected delayed hyper combo. Dan's other big buff is with his Otoku Michi Super. Like in the previous game, it leaves him with only a silver of health, but the damage this time around is absurd. So absurd, in fact, that it's actually the highest damaging hyper combo in the game that doesn't stem from a glitch or a loop. Dan's first assist is the Gadoken. His second assist is the Koryuken. His third assist is Premium Sign. And here are all of Dan's colors. Dan isn't actually too different in Capcom vs. SNK Pro compared to previous Versus games. He loses Otoku Michi in Premium Sign, but that's about it. He actually does get a new sprite set instead of reusing his alpha sprites, which is neat. Dan Kukiyaku retains its ability to be used in the air for Marvel 2. Koryuken's invulnerability is a different story, however. Instead of getting it granted for every 4th Koryuken, the chance of it happening now is made entirely random, making it much less reliable as a reversal. Dan's legendary taunt works slightly differently now in that it actually boosts your opponent's meter for every taunt performed, but if you manage to complete the whole thing, both you and your opponent's meters get filled up completely. Be sure to shake your opponent's hand if they let you get away with this. Here are all of Dan's colors. But now that we're at Capcom vs SNK, it's time to dive into Joe. Joe Higashi is a Muay Thai practitioner of Japanese lineage. The headband he wears was given to him by his grandmother before he left to train in Thailand, who always wanted him to remember where he came from. He went on to become a Muay Thai champion and entered the first official King of Fighters tournament in the first Fatal Fury game. Not to be confused with the fighting game series of the same name, based on the same tournament. For those unaware of SNK lore, there's essentially two main SNK continuities. There's the original timeline, which consists of the Art of Fighting series and Fatal Fury, as well as the Savage Reign and Kazuna Encounter duology a bit later on. The Last Blade series is also likely a distant prequel to the games in this chronology, as Zantetsu's moveset and fighting style in Last Blade implies that he may be a distant ancestor to Art of Fighting's Eiji. There's also the matter of Hibiki 1, which is connected to Art of Fighting by way of Ryo appearing as a playable character after having taken up the Mr. Karate mantle. His birth date in this game is a bit inconsistent with his birth date in Art of Fighting, but maybe SNK operates on a sliding timeline or something. I don't know. The second continuity is where the King of Fighters games take place. KOF was made into its own separate timeline so that the Art of Fighting and Fatal Fury characters could exist in their most iconic depictions without disrupting the lore in the main timeline. This timeline incorporates other SNK games like Akari Warriors and Psycho Soldier among others. Tangent aside, it's at this tournament where Joe meets Terry and Andy Bogard for the first time, and he learns that they're competing to avenge the death of their adopted father Jeff Bogard, who was killed by the tournament's host, Geese Howard. Joe, always in for a good time as long as strong opponents are involved, ends up befriending the two, forming a bond that lasts to this very day in series. For the most part, Joe wouldn't get too involved with the major plot beats over the course of the Fatal Fury series. He asks out Lily Kane, the sister of Billy Kane, Geese Howard's right-hand man, but Billy shuts that down as soon as he catches wind of it. In the first Fatal Fury game, he does have a rivalry with fellow Muay Thai practitioner YJ, who he defeats. The two become comrades after this, though. In the King of Fighters continuity, he seems to more or less have the same personality, albeit slightly goofier. With the exception of KOF 11, Joe is always a part of the Fatal Fury team alongside Terry and Andy usually, always being the one to convince the other two to team up again. Joe, being a Muay Thai practitioner, has some fierce kick techniques in his arsenal, but his other defining trait is his ability to create small tornadoes with a simple uppercut and use them offensively. His voice actor in both Capcom vs SNK games is Nobuyuki Hayama, who provided his voice in nearly all appearances from Fatal Fury 3 up to King of Fighters 13. Joe's first special move is the aforementioned Hurricane Upper, done with a half circle forward and light punch motion. He's had this one since the first Fatal Fury game. If you perform the same directional motion but with heavy punch instead, you'll get double Hurricane, which is exactly what it says on the tin. It's a bit slower though. Doing a Dragon Punch motion in any kick performs Joe's anti-air, Tiger Kick. The heavy version goes a lot higher than the light variation. This is also another one of his original Fatal Fury 1 moves. Half circle forward and kick gives you Slash Kick, a horizontally traveling kick attack. Its distance and strength is determined by which kick button you press. This one is from, wait for it, Fatal Fury 1. Joe's lone super in the game is Screw Upper, where he fires out a short-range tornado before sending out a much taller, much stronger one out directly in front of him. This first appeared as his desperation move in Fatal Fury 2. Here are all of Joe's colors.
announced a new challenger.
Before we move on to the Capcom vs SNK 2 section, being that this video is covering an SNK and Capcom character, I wanted to highlight a specific stage in CVS1 that combines locations and characters from both companies. Though I've done stage breakdowns on this channel in the past, in the spirit of this video's overarching theme of duos, I thought it'd be fun to bring aboard someone who specializes in them, so I brought Baberuthless into the fold to provide a breakdown of this particular stage. You may have seen her detailed analysis videos for locales like Kami's Super Street Fighter 2 stage or Tekken 5's Moonlit Wilderness stage, and if you haven't, well hey, what are you waiting for? A link to her channel will be pinned in the comments below so you can check them out. That said, take it away, Baberuthless.
Hi everyone, Baberuthless here to do a quick stage breakdown of the Sakazaki Dojo and Capcom vs SNK 1. Now, this stage is interesting because it's actually a dojo under construction, which you can see in the intro of the stage. From a story perspective, this dojo is owned by Takuma Sakazaki, or Ryo Sakazaki's father. As one of the most famous practitioners of the Kyokugen Ryu Karate, he also appears in some games as his alter ego, Mr. Karate. As one of the most famous practitioners of this style, Takuma has multiple dojos, including another one in Southtown, which is in America. This particular dojo under construction is likely some sort of expansion, with him trying to build on the Capcom part of town and potentially spread his karate style across Japan. And speaking of Japan, you can clearly see that this dojo is being built there by the architecture of the surrounding neighborhood. There is even a Japanese-style convenience store to the left called Sansan Mart, named after the game Sansan, and this store actually appears in Street Fighter Alpha 1 and some other Capcom games. I assume that in the Capcom verse, Sansan is a 24-hour convenience store in Japan similar to a Lawson or a Family Mart. This stage incorporates elements of both Capcom and SNK, which you can see in the subtle nods to other Capcom games. In the center of the stage, there is an American flag hanging in the background, probably since Takuma is American. Interestingly, it's missing the Japanese flag since Takuma is also Japanese, and both flags are shown equally in his other dojo stage in Art of Fighting 2. The purple sign with the yellow lettering here says Wind Woods Fire Mountain, though there could be some second meaning that I'm missing here since I'm not Japanese. The red lettering on the white sign on the left translates along the lines of Sakazaki Taoist or Buddhist rites, while on the right, the kanji translates to Japanese branch, presumably referring to the fact that this dojo is the Japanese branch of the Sakazaki dojos. The black word in the middle is Jotoshiki, which means roof or beam raising ceremony. It's a Japanese ceremony conducted to pray for the safety of a building once the main structure is raised, but the building isn't completed yet. And you can see here that the dojo is very much still under construction, with the unsecured floorboards shaking as you walk across them. The Jotoshiki here is ironic considering that your characters are about to screw everything up. As the match progresses, you see that the stage gets more and more destroyed, with planks of wood and the structure falling apart after a hard knockdown. Once one of the main support beams drops, the room caves in soon afterwards, and I'm not so sure those new dojo plans are gonna work out for Takuma. Also funny, to the left of the stage you can see a Daruma doll, which is a traditional Japanese doll, a symbol of good luck, and a wish-granting talisman. When you buy a Daruma, the eyes are completely white, but after choosing a wish, you fill in one of the eyes in black, and fill in the second one once your wish has been fulfilled. Here you can see that one of the eyes is unfilled, meaning that the wish hasn't been granted. I'm assuming that the wish likely has to do with the dojo being built, so it's really not looking too good here. With all the commotion that the fighters are making, it's no wonder that Takuma himself is urging you to leave, though your fighters seem to just be ignoring everything around them. What's weird to me here is that Takuma could easily just join in on the fight and square up with any of these characters, but maybe it's been a long day for him or something. Next to Takuma are what seem to be his contractors for hire, taking a nice lunch break. They're here to get paid, but not to intervene and are just watching the fight. One of these contractors is Edge from Rival Schools. Another one might be Gore Diamond, which would make sense since this is one of the few stages he won't be in the background if Kyo and Banamaru are fighting. The bald guy in the middle could also maybe be Temjin from Art of Fighting 2, but I'm not too sure. My second guess was Chang, but he's a little too short. But anyways, what I do know for sure is that these other two characters aren't Edge's friends from rival schools or Chang. Music-wise, the stage song is called Stage of Sakazaki Scrap Beats. It has that similar synth and top hat sound as the opening theme, but is much more even in volume and pace. I would almost describe the song as a little bit droning, but the high BPM, the synth and the melody, and some smaller flourishes in the song work to make it a little bit more energetic. It's not really a song I would expect to hear at the Sakazaki Dojo, since I would expect it to be a little bit more dynamic and high stakes, but it is a song that fits right in with the rest of the Capcom vs SNK 1 soundtrack.
Last on the list for both characters is Capcom vs SNK 2. Dan unfortunately doesn't see many, if any, changes at all from CVS 1. The most notable benefit he gets is the ability to make his Koryukin somewhat invincible thanks to the infamous roll cancel glitch. For the uninitiated, the roll cancel glitch revolves around the game's universal roll mechanic, which has 27 frames of invulnerability. By quickly inputting a roll command during the input of a special move, you can transfer the roll's invulnerability into the special move itself, which is a pretty powerful tool and defines high-level CVS 2 play. Other than that, Dan is more or less the same. Joe, on the other hand, actually gets some interesting stuff in CVS 2, to the extent that his CVS 1 incarnation almost feels half-baked in comparison. For one, he gets his Bakretsu Ken Super from Fatal Fury 1. You mash the punch button to get this.
Oh yeah!
Ogan no Kakato is done with a quarter circle back and kick. This is a leaping kick attack Joe first got in Fatal Fury 3. Bakuretsu Hurricane Tiger Kakato is done with a quarter circle motion, followed immediately by a half circle back and punch motion. This super combines some of his special moves into one assault. He first got this in KOF 97.
The combination attack.
His last super is his strongest one, Double Cyclone. Weirdly enough, it seems like this move actually debuted specifically in this game, though a slightly altered version of it would appear in the KOF series from 2002 onwards under the name Cross Giganticness. Here are all of Dan and Joe's colors in CVS 2. Joe and Dan also have some special intros with other characters.
This battle is about to explode. Fight! This is gonna be a match to remember. Fight! This battle is about to explode. Fight! Live and let die. Fight! Live and let die. Fight! This is gonna be a match to remember. Fight!
And that's a wrap on the breakdown for these two lovable fighting game goofballs. Thankfully, I'd say that both characters are on the upswing these days. Dan made it not only to Street Fighter 4, but Street Fighter 5 as well, where his taunt mechanic can be utilized to cancel in and out of moves and create unique combo routes that wouldn't be possible otherwise. He's probably the most fun version of the character to date. Joe's been trucking along in KOF for all these years, but now he's confirmed for Fatal Fury City of the Wolves, so it'll be really neat to see how they change him up in that game. Thanks to everyone for watching, and a huge thanks again to Baberuthless for stopping by to do the stage breakdown. If you enjoy my content, then I highly recommend checking out her breakdowns on fighting game stages, as well as other often overlooked aspects of the genre, like music customization. She has a sharp eye for detail, and I bet you'll learn something new by watching. Be sure to like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.